In May 2019, a small counter-narcotics unit was rolling down a country road in a rural part of Sinaloa, which was the center of the global drug empire created by El Chapo Guzman. They were overcome by a pretty powerful smell. They were literally stopped in their tracks, and it's one of the things that people on these counter-narcotics squads are looking out for, smelling out for in this case. So they got out of their vehicles, and through a clearing of trees, they found 5 cauldrons that were being used to produce heroin. And they also found 4 jugs of a chemical called acetic anhydride that was made by a major multi-billion-dollar American company, and the product brand was J.T. Baker. And that chemical is the only thing other than the sap from opium flowers that you need to manufacture heroin. And under international drug laws, it's one of the most highly controlled of these chemicals sold anywhere in the world, except Mexico. The great tragedy for me in investigating this was the idea that any American company could be involved in that, even if it's unknowing. It really made us feel like we had to do everything we could to expose this situation and make it public. In the 1980s, there was a flood of cocaine production from Latin America into the United States.
An epidemic of crack in New York is now out of control.
And there was a huge surge in the use of cocaine and then crack cocaine.
You have no words to describe how bad it is. I've seen young mothers with babies in strollers and small toddlers at their skirt tail buying crack in the neighborhood where I live.
Amid sort of like a lot of concern and even some hysteria in the United States about the cocaine problem, the CIA and the Drug Enforcement Administration in the US made a rather embarrassing discovery that about 95% of the chemicals that were used to make cocaine in South America for the US all came from American chemical companies.
Behind closed doors at Senate offices on Capitol Hill, the Senate Intelligence Committee began its investigation this morning, one of several committees that want to carry out hearings.
In Congress, there was a scandal, and there was a pretty swift reaction, and so there were significant amendments to the drug laws requiring chemical companies to take responsibility for their sales overseas and to make sure that from start to finish, the supply of drug-making chemicals went to customers who had a legitimate purpose to use them and weren't diverted to the drug trade. The U.S. aggressively pushed international drug laws around the world, and virtually every country has adopted domestic and international controls over these very same chemicals. There's a list called the Red List, and that list contains the chemicals that are of the most concern and that are the most highly regulated. At the very top, the chemical that is of the most concern internationally, and has been since 2001, is a chemical called acetic anhydride. And it is the only critical essential chemical that you need to make heroin, and that's why it's number 1 on the Red List, and it's number 1 under international narcotics laws. We were trying to figure out, knowing that acetic anhydride was absolutely necessary for making heroin, and it was strictly controlled, how the drug cartels were getting access to it.
Internationally, acetic anhydride is heavily regulated. For 18 years, Mexico avoided stringent regulations. They said that it was too costly for companies, it wasn't necessary. In 2018, they tightened the regulations, but even with those tighter regulations, we saw that sale of quantities that should have been regulated fell through the cracks, went completely unnoticed. Regions where a lot of poppy is being grown, farmers have to resort to growing the plant, mainly because of poverty. They're not either able to sustain their families with the usual corn or bean crops, or they actually sometimes get threatened by cartel groups that require that they grow them on their plots. Mexico production of heroin waxes and wanes, but at its height, there There's a huge demand from the cartels for acetic anhydride because that's really the only ingredient missing for them. They have the farmers producing their poppy for them, so they just need to get a hold of some, jugs of the chemical, and then they're ready to go. These chemical labs all over poppy producing regions, some of them get seized by the government, and then the government snaps photos of them, sends them to the media. The media puts them up on their websites, and with a simple Google search, you can see what these labs look like. So I'm scouring Google looking for chemical labs and busts by the Army, and I see a bunch of them, and they normally have a lot of unmarked blue barrels or unmarked bottles of chemicals. But I came upon one photo where I actually saw there was a label, and the label read J.T. Baker. I went through more searches and I saw it in another photo, and J.T. Baker just kept popping up as one of the only labels that you could actually see on the chemical in these lab busts. So we realized, okay, something's happening here.
So J.T. Baker was a century-old American brand that had this really good worldwide reputation for its purity, and its purity and control of its production was a huge part of its marketing to chemists at universities, to chemists in the pharmaceutical industry who use it in R&D, research and development labs. It had been bought, the brand, in August of 2010 by a company that became known as Avantor.
From discovery to delivery, scientists and research professionals worldwide trust Avantor.
They really had a strong presence in the lab chemical market worldwide, but especially in the Americas. Their operation in Mexico was a significant player for them in the industry. So as we started looking into this J.T. Baker brand, we started discovering a lot of really extraordinary things. Sellers and distributors in Mexico that we spoke to told us that it was incredibly popular with the narcos. And the reason it was so popular was because, for the same reason that it was marketed for laboratories, was its purity and its reputation for purity. We found that the company was selling it in these rather extraordinary containers. So they're 20-liter size containers, it's a pretty substantial black plastic container to keep the sunlight out. Avantor had said that this specific container was the largest amount of chemical you could get in a container designed for a single operator to be able to still use handily. Now, the narcos absolutely loved these jugs. They were perfect for the cottage industry nature production of heroin in Mexico.
So one thing we found once we sort of studied the market in Mexico and studied Avantor was that Avantor distributes in Mexico through what are called channel partners, which are essentially distributors. And by law, they're only supposed to sell acetic anhydride to legitimate users. I started going down the list of the channel partners, and I just picked one and went out to see them. They were sort of on the outskirts of Mexico City in a very industrial area. I started talking to the sales manager, and he basically said, you can buy it as long as you can pay for it. He didn't require any proof that I was a legitimate lab. You could easily just walk in and buy this stuff quite cheaply, actually, and take it to your heroin lab and produce heroin with ease. So that was pretty shocking to see.
In November 2019, I was in Mexico reporting on the ground, and I went into this medical supply store with a Mexican colleague, and we bought a 1-liter glass bottle of J.T. Baker acetic anhydride. And the seller volunteered to us that he could easily get us an 18-liter jug. And with that one 18-liter jug that you can buy for about $300, you can make about $1 million worth of heroin. And we also found that these 18-liter jugs were being sold on the biggest e-commerce platform in Latin America. It's called Mercado Libre. It's huge in Mexico. It's kind of a mix between Amazon and Alibaba, I guess you would say. And it was on offer from several sellers online publicly in Mercado Libre. We weren't supposed to be able to buy it unless we were legitimate buyers, but we didn't have any trouble getting it.
One thing we noticed on the Avantor products that we were able to purchase is it said made in Mexico in Spanish. right there. And we were like, well, that's interesting because Aventor has, these plants outside of in the U.S. basically. So how can they say made in Mexico? And it turns out that somehow they are bringing the chemicals, the ingredients, and putting it into the jugs in Mexico in a facility they have in Mexico. And it's actually produced by a subsidiary in Mexico. So it really is made in Mexico, at least under Mexican law. So that basically allows Aventor and conceivably other companies to produce this stuff in Mexico, which means they have to comply with Mexican regulations.
Everything was done in Mexico to create and sell this product. The company was able to say that it did everything perfectly legally under Mexican law, because Mexican law was the only thing that applied, because Mexican was kind of this island unto itself in international drug laws for the heroin-making chemical. So they said, of course, that they hadn't violated the law, that their sellers, the distributors and the retailers that they sold to, were responsible for who the end user was.
In 2014 alone, more than 47,000 people died from drug overdoses, more than any single previous year in American history.
In addition to cutting across virtually every demographic in America, the heroin epidemic has cut across virtually every region of the country. No urban part of America has been more devastated by opioids and by heroin than Philadelphia. The city of Philadelphia has a large neighborhood called Kensington.
It's an area that's become synonymous with drug use. It's even earned the nickname the Walmart of heroin.
The Drug Enforcement Administration routinely undercover buys and tests heroin from across the United States to do chemical analysis of where it's coming from to determine its strength, its potency, its purity, and they also track the price because that gives them, again, a good idea of what's happening. The heroin that they've bought in Philadelphia, which almost certainly came from Kensington, is the most potent, purest heroin that they've found for sale anywhere in the United States. And the great irony of that is that Aventor, which sells J.T. Baker branded acetic anhydride that was used to make heroin in Mexico, their headquarters is just 15 miles away from the Kensington neighborhood. The day that our story came out, Aventor, in consultation with its CEO and its general counsel, decided immediately that they were going to pull the product from across Mexico. It was a pretty extraordinary move for them to make, and I think it was also quite telling in terms of how concerned they were with the evidence that we published about how their product, their company, was being used to fuel heroin production for the United States.